September 20th, 1992, Pine Knob Music Theater, Detroit. Kurt Cobain stood on stage, his fragile frame dwarfed by the massive amplifiers behind him, feeling the familiar weight of 50,000 expectations crushing down on his sensitive soul. The crowd's energy was overwhelming, too much, always too much, but he pushed through his anxiety, channeling his inner turmoil into the raw power of Smells Like Teen Spirit. Then he saw something that would shatter his carefully constructed emotional barriers and reveal the depths of his empathy in ways that shocked the world. This is the story of the night Kurt Cobain's psychological fragility became his greatest strength, and why his act of compassion almost destroyed him. Now I'm going to tell you how one moment of pure human connection exposed both the beauty and the burden of Kurt's hypersensitive heart. By September 1992, Kurt Cobain was drowning in the success he never wanted. Nevermind had catapulted Nirvana from underground darlings to global superstars. But for Kurt a deeply introverted artist who felt everything too intensely, too, fame was a psychological prison. His sensitive nature, which made his songwriting so authentic and emotionally raw, made celebrity life unbearable on a cellular level. The grunge explosion of the early 1990s had transformed Seattle's underground scene into a corporate gold mine. Record executives descended like vultures, signing every band with distorted guitars and flannel shirts, turning authentic artistic expression into marketable commodities. For Kurt, who valued artistic authenticity above all else, watching his deeply personal music become a marketing commodity was psychological torture that ate at his soul daily. He'd been struggling with heroin addiction for months, using drugs to numb the overwhelming emotions that fame brought crashing down on his hypersensitive nervous system. Each needle was an attempt to silence the psychological storm that made crowds feel like electrical fires and interviews feel like public executions. His relationship with Courtney Love was volatile and dramatic, feeding his already fragile mental state with constant emotional chaos and unpredictable psychological warfare. The man who wrote Something in the Way about sleeping under a bridge, feeling invisible and worthless, was now expected to be a spokesman for Generation, a role that terrified his introverted soul and contradicted everything about his psychological makeup. Kurt's character was fundamentally incompatible with celebrity culture. Where fame demanded confident extroversion, Kurt possessed crippling self-doubt and preferred solitude. Where stardom required emotional distance, Kurt felt everything with devastating, overwhelming intensity. That night in Detroit, Kurt walked onto the stage carrying the crushing weight of his internal conflicts like physical chains around his sensitive spirit. His blonde hair hung like a protective curtain over his eyes, a shield against the staring crowd's expectations and demands. Every scream from the audience felt like needles against his hypersensitive nervous system. The roar of approval that other artists craved and thrived on felt to Kurt like psychological assault, like being attacked by sound itself. The Pine Knob Amphitheater stretched out before him like an ocean of overwhelming human need and expectation. 25,000 people, each one projecting their hopes, frustrations, anger, and pain onto his fragile psyche, demanding that he carry their emotional burdens while managing his own psychological crisis. Kurt's anxiety peaked dangerously as he strapped on his guitar, his hands trembling visibly from both withdrawal and panic attacks that threatened to overwhelm his ability to perform. But something else was driving Kurt's emotional state that particular night, adding another layer to his already overwhelming psychological burden. Earlier, backstage in the small, cramped dressing room, he'd received a heartbreaking letter from a teenage fan describing her struggles with depression, cutting, and suicidal thoughts. The letter had triggered Kurt's own traumatic memories of childhood, missed his parents' brutal divorce, the relentless bullying at school, the years of feeling like an alien in his own life, unwanted and misunderstood. This psychological burden, feeling responsible for his fans' emotional welfare and mental health, was slowly destroying what remained of Kurt's fragile sense of self. His empathetic nature made it impossible to maintain the emotional distance that healthy celebrity required for psychological survival. Every fan letter about depression felt like a personal failure, a sign that his music was somehow making things worse. Every suicide linked to his songs felt like blood on his already guilt-stained hands. As Nirvana launched into their set with explosive energy, Kurt's emotional intensity was visible to anyone paying close attention to his psychological state. His guitar playing was more aggressive than usual, each chord struck with the violence of someone trying to exorcise demons through pure sound and fury. His voice was rawer, more vulnerable and exposed, as if he was purging his deepest psychological pain through every tortured lyric. The crowd's response fed directly into Kurt's internal conflict, creating a feedback loop of psychological torture. They cheered loudest when he seemed most tortured and broken, as if his suffering was their entertainment, their validation that authentic pain could be packaged and sold. The same sensitivity that made his music genuine and emotionally powerful made their worship feel like exploitation of his deepest wounds. During Lithium, Kurt's voice cracked with genuine emotion as he sang about his mental health struggles, bipolar episodes, and desperate attempts to find stability in an unstable world. The irony wasn't lost on his hypersensitive consciousness. He was performing his breakdown for entertainment, commodifying his psychological pain for an audience that cheered his suffering while remaining safely distant from its reality. Dave Grohl noticed Kurt's psychological distress from behind the drums, his steady rhythm providing the only anchor in Kurt's emotional storm. They'd been friends long enough for Dave to recognize when Kurt was spiraling into one of his dark psychological spaces, when the depression was winning the battle against his will to perform and connect. Tonight felt different, more intense, more dangerous, like standing too close to a cliff edge. The crowd, completely oblivious to Kurt's internal struggle and psychological breakdown happening in real time, demanded more authenticity, more pain, more of his soul served up for their consumption. They wanted the tortured artist, the beautiful sadness, the genuine anguish that made his music so powerful and emotionally devastating. But for Kurt, every cheer felt like validation of his worst fears, that people loved his art more than they cared about his humanity. As they began Smells Like Teen Spirit, the song that had made them famous and trapped Kurt in an inescapable cage of unwanted expectations and commercial pressure, his anxiety reached a psychological breaking point. The crowd's response was deafening, a wall of sound that made his sensitive ears ring painfully and his fragile psyche recoil in horror. This was the moment he always dreaded, when the performance became too real, too overwhelming for his introverted nature to handle without complete psychological collapse. The song's massive success had become Kurt's personal nightmare, a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen from his artistic ideals and authentic creative vision. Every time they played it, he was reminded of his failure to maintain artistic integrity in the face of commercial success. The anthem of teenage rebellion had become a corporate product, played endlessly on radio stations that completely missed its satirical intent and deeper meaning. But then something happened that cut through all his psychological barriers and touched the core of his empathetic soul, something that would transform his understanding of what it meant to use his hypersensitivity for good instead of self-destruction. In the middle of the song's second verse, Kurt's hypersensitive awareness picked up something wrong in the crowd. His artist's intuition, honed by years of feeling everything too deeply and noticing details others missed, detected a disturbance that security and other performers completely overlooked. About 30 rows back, a teenage girl had collapsed, not from excitement or typical concert hysteria, but from genuine medical distress that demanded immediate intervention. For most performers, this would register as a minor crowd control issue, something for security to handle efficiently while the show continued without interruption. The show must go on. Mindset, that's the cardinal rule of professional entertainment, drilled into every performer from their first paid gig. But Kurt Cobain wasn't most performers. His psychological makeup made him fundamentally incapable of ignoring human suffering, even when acknowledging it meant professional suicide and career damage. The girl was Sarah Martinez, 16 years old, suffering from undiagnosed diabetes that her family's limited healthcare access had never properly identified or treated. The combination of not eating all day due to concert excitement, standing in the intense heat for hours, and overwhelming emotional stimulation had sent her blood sugar plummeting dangerously low. She was going into diabetic shock while her friends panicked helplessly around her, their desperate screams for help lost in the overwhelming crowd noise and musical chaos. Kurt's empathetic nature made him feel the girl's distress as if it were his own physical pain, his own medical emergency happening in real time. The same emotional intensity that fueled his songwriting and tortured his daily existence, now laser focused on this stranger's crisis with overwhelming clarity. His fragile mental state, usually a psychological liability that made normal life nearly impossible, became a superpower of human connection and moral clarity. Without thinking about professional consequences, crowd management, insurance liability, or the potential career damage, Kurt stopped playing mid-verse. His action defied every rule of performance, every expectation of professional behavior, every piece of management advice he'd ever received about maintaining show momentum. But it aligned perfectly with his authentic character, man whose artistic integrity meant putting human connection above commercial obligation. The sudden silence was jarring beyond description, like the world had suddenly stopped spinning. 50,000 people, caught mid-scream in their collective worship and emotional release, found themselves in confused, uncomfortable quiet. The absence of music created a psychological vacuum that seemed to suck the energy out of the entire amphitheater, leaving everyone suspended in uncertain tension. What happened next would haunt Kurt for the rest of his short life, not because he regretted it, but because it revealed truths about himself he wasn't psychologically prepared to face or integrate into his self-concept. Kurt Cobain, the man who wrote songs about feeling invisible and unwanted, made himself the most visible person in the amphitheater to help a stranger survive. "There's a girl down there who needs help," Kurt announced into his microphone, his voice carrying the unwavering authority of someone willing to sacrifice everything for principle. Everyone around her, give her space. Security, section 15, row 30, right now. The crowd began to understand what was happening, and something beautiful and unexpected occurred. Instead of annoyance at the interrupted interpendum, instead of demands for their show to continue, the audience immediately responded with collective humanity. The people around Sarah created space, lifted her friends' calls for help, transformed from consumers into caregivers in an instant of shared compassion. But Kurt's empathetic nature couldn't be satisfied with delegation or watching from a safe distance. The same psychological intensity that made him feel responsible for every fan's emotional well-being now demanded direct personal action. Despite his introverted nature, despite his terror of crowds and physical contact, despite every anxious instinct that told him to retreat to safety, Kurt made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He jumped off the stage. For someone as psychologically fragile as Kurt, entering the crowd was an act of supreme courage that went against every fiber of his being. His anxiety disorder made crowds feel like drowning in an ocean of judgment and overwhelming stimulation. His sensory sensitivity made the noise and chaos overwhelming to the point of physical pain. But his empathy was stronger than his fear, his compassion deeper than his psychological barriers, his humanity more powerful than his carefully constructed celebrity persona. Kurt pushed through security guards who tried to stop him, his usual meekness and conflict avoidance replaced by determined urgency that surprised everyone present. "I'm trained for this," he called back, referring to the EMT certification he'd quietly earned years earlier, a detail that revealed his secret desire to help people, to be useful for something more meaningful than entertainment and artistic expression. The crowd parted for him like water. creating a path of stunned silence through the sea of humanity. 50,000 people watched their tortured rock god transform into a medical responder, trading his guitar for the chance to save a life. The man who wrote about feeling powerless was demonstrating the ultimate power, the courage to act when action mattered more than image or career concerns. When Kurt reached Sarah, his psychological transformation was complete and beautiful. To witness the anxiety, the self-doubt, the crushing weight of expectations, the constant internal criticism, all of it fell away as his natural empathy took complete control. This was who Kurt Cobain really was beneath the artistic persona, someone who felt others' pain as intensely as his own and couldn't rest while someone suffered needlessly. Sarah was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid, her skin pale and clammy, her friends crying in absolute panic around her small form. Kurt's EMT training kicked in immediately, but so did something deeper and more profound. A psychological need to nurture, to heal, to use his hypersensitivity for good instead of self-destructive artistic torment. Does anyone know if she's diabetic? Kurt asked Sarah's friends, his voice gentle but urgent, carrying the authority of someone who understood medical crisis intimately. Has she eaten today? Any medical conditions? His questions revealed not just medical knowledge, but also the careful attention of someone who understood suffering and crisis from personal experience. The irony was profound and heartbreaking. Kurt Cobain, who struggled daily with his own psychological survival and thoughts of death, was fighting desperately to save someone else's life. The man who would be dead within 2 years was using every resource at his disposal to ensure a stranger lived to see tomorrow and beyond. When Sarah's friend mentioned she hadn't eaten and felt dizzy earlier, Kurt immediately recognized diabetic shock, perhaps because his own relationship with food was complicated by depression and drug use. He understood how easily the body could betray you when your mind was already under siege from internal and external pressures. "Sarah, I'm Kurt," he whispered to her unconscious form, his voice carrying a tenderness that millions of fans had never heard. "You're going to be okay. Your friends are here. Help is coming, and you're surrounded by people who care about you." When Kurt returned to the stage, his emotional state was completely transformed. The anxiety that usually plagued his performances had been replaced by purpose that went beyond entertainment. He dedicated something in the way to Sarah, but as he sang about feeling invisible, the lyrics took on new meaning. He'd helped someone else feel seen and valued, but his own psychological homelessness remained unchanged. Kurt struggled to articulate what the experience meant. "I realized that night that I've been using my sensitivity as an excuse to hide from the world," he told Rolling Stone, "but Sarah needed that sensitivity. Maybe being too emotional isn't always a weakness." The comment revealed his ongoing struggle with his own nature. His action at Pine Knob proved that his psychological makeup, his hypersensitivity, empathy, inability to ignore suffering wasn't a flaw but a gift. The same traits that made fame unbearable made him capable of extraordinary compassion. For Sarah, the incident became a defining moment. "Kurt saved my life medically, but he also saved me psychologically," she reflected. "Having someone see me as a human being worth saving, not just a face in the crowd." This understanding led her to become a pediatric nurse, inspired by Kurt's example of using empathy to heal others. The Pine Knob incident proved that qualities society dismisses as weakness can be sources of extraordinary strength. Kurt's hypersensitivity wasn't a character flaw, but enabled him to see suffering others missed and respond with courage others couldn't muster. Perhaps the real tragedy isn't just that the world lost a brilliant artist, but that it failed to protect someone whose sensitivity was both his greatest gift and fatal vulnerability. Kurt's emotional fragility wasn't his failure, it was his superpower in a world that feels too little.